for being here today with us. My name is Jerome Go, CAM of Background Trust Corporation. And for this afternoon, I'm going to be your host. So we would like also to take this opportunity to recognize and appreciate our annual corporate sponsors. For Platinum sponsor, we have Sea Oil Philippines Inc. Silver sponsors, we have BDO Capital, Coco Life Asset Management Company Inc. and FTI Consulting Philippines. And of course, for bronze sponsors, we have AP Securities Incorporated, DBP, Daiwa Capital Markets Philippines, and finally, Papa Securities Corporation. So thank you to our corporate sponsors for your continuous support of this CFA Local Society Philippines. To formally welcome all of us, may we please have the trustee and treasurer of CFA Society Philippines, Mr. John Balse, CFA. John?
Thank you very much, Jerome. Good afternoon, everyone. And like what Jerome said, happy Easter to everyone. We hope that you are all safe and well. We are very much delighted that you have come out of your very busy schedules to be here with us today to learn more about the CFA Institute's Certificate in ESG Investing. As you will find out shortly, this groundbreaking certification will definitely give you a head start in the fast-growing field of ESG investing. For us investment practitioners, the need to be more and more conscious about ESG investing has never been more relevant in the face of climate change, food security, widening social gaps, and corporate governance. We are delighted to have here with us today Mr. Richard McGillivray. He's an avid supporter of the CFA Society of the Philippines, and we're very thankful for his presence today. He's the Senior Director for Institutional Partnerships at the CFA Institute for Asia Pacific to talk more about this certification. As well, and we are also delighted to have our esteemed CFA Society Philippines President Robert Ramos to talk about his experience in undertaking the certification process. We look forward to a very engaging information session with all of you. Again, our sincerest gratitude to all of you for being with us here today this afternoon. So let us begin. Back to you, Jerome.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that opening remarks. It really sets the tone for this webinar. Personally, I'm really passionate of this info session because I personally took my certificate in this ESG investing. I enrolled last year and took it a month ago, and I've learned a lot. And I know with this info session, you will appreciate it more. So again, welcome to the webinar. This webinar is brought to you by CFA Society Philippines and the CFA Institute. So joining us today to talk about the CFA or the Certificate in ESG Investing, he joined CFA Institute in June 2013. He leads the Asia Pacific Institutional Partnerships team, which is responsible for working with firms, regulators, and university across the region. Richard brings a blend of experience in investment management and education to CFA Institute. Prior to CFA Institute, he set up the Asia Pacific operations for a UK headquartered asset management business for whom he built and supported a broad client base, including private and retail banks, institutions, fund of funds, and family offices across Asia Pacific, even Europe and Africa. Prior to that, he worked for 20 years in adult and professional education, Asia Pacific and Southern Africa across a range of sectors, including in universities, financial services, media, aid agencies, and law. Without further ado, we may call on the Senior Director, Institutional Partnership of CFA Institute, APAC, Mr. Richard McGillivray. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jerome, and it's wonderful to be with friends and colleagues again today. Happy Easter to all of you, and I hope that this finds all of you and your loved ones well in the wake of the difficult times that we've faced. I'm going to start off by sharing my screen, if that's okay. I wanted to kind of make a commitment to ensure that while we talk about the certificate, we also kind of appropriately set the context for what's driving the certificate and what indeed is driving ESG. So I'm just going to dive straight into it. I've got 30 minutes. I'd like to spend about 10 of those minutes setting the context, if I may. So, just to begin with, what is driving ESG globally? And what I've tried to do here is go from a macro perspective and then sort of drill right down to the individual level. So just sort of starting off with the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. This is the 2021 report. The 22 report has actually just been released. It just has slightly different formatting, which doesn't lend itself to presentations. But if you have a look at the 2021 top global risks by likelihood, and these have changed only in the sense that global conflict has been introduced to the list as a consequence of the conflict in the Ukraine. But if we have a look at that top list, we've got extreme weather, climate action failure, human environmental damage, infectious disease, which of course relates to the pandemic, and then critically biodiversity loss. And so these are, in a sense, the things that unify us. I mean, I think the pandemic and geopolitics have sort of pushed in the opposite direction of globalization, but really as a collective of humans, we are united by these challenges. I myself am based in Hong Kong at the moment, but I come from Southern Africa. Now, the reason that I want to start with this slide as well is that emerging markets and frontier markets, and in particular in this case, a country like the Philippines, is particularly vulnerable to many of those global risks, if you like. So with the very significant coastline of 7,000 islands, history of extreme weather that is likely to worsen. The people of the Philippines need action on behalf of all others. And I think that, again, is what this unifying undertaking is about. So pulling out slightly, if we have a look at the sort of some of the responses to that global challenge, you've seen a huge number of countries make commitments to net zero. I think one of the things that we're discovering and one we'll learn about in the certificate is that the commitment is relatively easy. The action plan for achieving it is much more complex. But of course, when you have these kinds of commitments, then you're also going to see a slew of regulations. And I'm just going to kind of pause and just go slightly granular at this point. For these net zero targets to be achieved, and for effective action against climate change to be taken, what is essential is that carbon starts to be priced. And I thought it would just be interesting to put this slide in. I know it's tough to read on a small screen, but there are a couple of things that I want to sort of draw out in this slide. So these are examples of countries across the world and what the effective price of carbon is in those countries. And the red arrow, the red triangle at the bottom is what I think, I looked at some research reports this morning. That is the approximate price of carbon in the Philippines, so around $12 to $13 per ton. And what is interesting here is that for those net zero commitments to be achieved, during 2020, the carbon price across the world should have been between $40 to $80 per ton. So that's that gray band that you can see in the middle. And I think the thing that's so striking here is the number of countries that fall outside of that band. And in fact, if we go to 2021 and look at the OECD figures, that is where carbon should be currently priced, okay, at around $100 a ton for us to achieve those net zero targets and to pull back the negative effects of climate change. So you can see there's an incredible amount of work to be done. But looking at it through the eyes of an investment professional, if you regard carbon as essentially a production cost in any business's undertakings, and you consider where those carbon prices are, you can see the massive effect that increased and rapidly increasing carbon pricing is likely to have on valuation. So this is very much a challenge for all people, as you saw from the previous slide, trickle down to countries, but ultimately the carbon price is going to be the critical factor. Now, of course, if you want to achieve those kind of outcomes, you can also expect a massive regulatory response. And that is indeed what we've seen. So what this graph shows you is this rapid increase in regulatory and policy interventions. And there are a couple that I wanted to call out in particular. And I thought it was particularly interesting, this relationship between voluntary standards and then national and in de facto global standards that emerge from that. And a good example is TCFD on the right-hand side. That's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That is originally a voluntary standard, but it has been adopted by a range of different institutions across the world and is increasingly being mandated. So, for example, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange will mandate TCFD reporting for all listed companies by 2025. SFDR, which of course relates directly to financial businesses and their disclosures, is also a very powerful influence, if you like. And forthcoming regulations that I think are going to have a real effect one way or another. TNFD, which is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and that's the task force that targets biodiversity and the protection of the biodiversity. And again, I want to call out in the Philippines that biodiversity is critical to the survival and the well-being of people in the Philippines. And then, of course, CSRD, which is Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And CSRD is interesting because that really starts to talk about the impact that businesses have on the environment. At the moment, much of what is being reported on and evaluated and covered by rating agencies is the impact the environment has on a business. So you can start seeing that bidirectional materiality coming in. Now, asset owners and investment managers have responded globally to this challenge. And so what you see here is the increase in the number of signatories to the PRI. And I want to kind of draw your attention on the left-hand side that the assets under management of these signatories is now around $135 trillion, okay, which is very, very close to the total value of global market capitalization. So these are very, very significant commitments. And again, you can see those voluntary standards coming in, but becoming mandated. So TCFD disclosures are required by PRI signatories from this year, from 2021. Now, the other thing that I want to do now, again, we're going from the macro, drilling down to the individual, is to ask yourself, okay, so all these signatories, these net zero commitments, the price of carbon, what does that start to mean for people who are working in the industry? And so I just picked out, these are the principles that signatories to the PRI commit to. And I just want to kind of focus on the first three. So principle one, we will incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis. So in other words, investment analysis conducted on $135 trillion worth of assets. And of course, that is probably a mix of private and public assets in that total number, is going to require ESG related analysis. Principle two, we're going to be active owners and incorporate ESG issues into our ownership policies and practices. So of course, that also affects ETFs and passive offerings, trackers, index funds, etc. That then the owners or the managers of those funds as active shareholders engage with those businesses on ESG issues. In order to do that effectively, you need to have effective ESG analysis in order to identify the issues that you want to engage in. And then principle three, we will seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues by the entities in which we invest. So again, you're seeing this massive of historically non-financial data, but materially relevant data that is starting to come into play in the financial services sector in order to achieve those global, national, and investment house commitments, if you like. So we know that this is increasingly going to be a critical area of expertise for people working in the industry. Now, what is also quite interesting is if we have a look at asset flows into sustainability related investment products, you can see the very significant growth. The bracket that's pointing downwards just looks at Q1, 2, and 3. Now, what I find particularly interesting about these graphs is that the bulk of those asset flows are in fact European. And I think that we can regard European sustainability practices a leading indicator for the rest of the world. And there are lots of ways that happen. So TCFD, for example, has its origins in Europe, but is now increasingly being adopted around the world. I think it's reasonable to expect that there are similarly going to be asset flows into sustainability related investment products in both the US and the rest of the world. So we all sit in that small yellow bar at the top. So this is kind of an indicator of what is to come in terms of assets and commitments to these projects, if you like. Now, how ready are people to support this work in the workplace? And I think this is such an interesting piece of research here. This comes from LinkedIn Analytics and a 2020 report that we did. So it's slightly dated, but we think that this gap is potentially widened. What we did is we looked at over 1 million profiles on LinkedIn. We looked at the sustainability related skills that those profiles listed. And then we compared that to jobs posted on LinkedIn and the sustainability requirements of those jobs. Okay. And in effect, what we see across the board is that there is, in effect, 10 times the demand for sustainability related skills in the investment management industry than there is the supply. Now, those of you with sharp eyes will see that the gap is smallest in the case of analysts, but this in itself is quite interesting. Analysts have for many years focused on governance. And of course, the G in ESG is governance. So we think that there is, that gap is somewhat smaller in the analyst space because there is this focus on governance. Of course, the E, environmental, the S, the social pillars are increasingly coming into play. So don't be fooled by the analyst gap there. I think that, as I say, I think this is a widening gap. Why do I say that? We're starting to see salary premiums being paid. And I've just looked at data from the Greater China area. Salary premiums between 15 and 50% in Greater China are being paid for sustainability related expertise. So I think that starts to illustrate the gap here on the screen playing out in real terms. These are essential skills and increasingly essential skills for the investment management industry. And it's in itself not sustainable that people pay salary premiums for this skills gap. So key issues to bear in mind then, all right? There's expanding regulation and of course there's expanding scientific understanding. As that scientific understanding expands further, so there's more data. The more the data there is, the greater the reliance on analysis. So again, that ability to manage non-financial but material data in finance is, I think, a critical issue. There's also been an expansion of focus from the governance pillar, as I mentioned, to increasingly the environmental and social pillars, if you like. Climate and climate-related environmental issues are really coming to the fore, so that's driving a lot of focus in the environmental pillar, but increasingly biodiversity and the impact on firms on the bio-ecosystem, and that's the TNFD disclosures that are coming to the fore. I think it's so important to remember that systems thinking is really important in understanding these ESG issues. So this is when an event happens in one area, how does it affect behavior, actions, and demands and needs in other areas? So for example, an interesting fact that I learned recently, if you drive a car and it releases carbon from its exhaust, it takes between 7 and 14 days for that carbon to circulate the earth. Okay, so that is the extent to which we are kind of bound together in trying to address these challenges. And of course, in order to address those challenges, there's increasingly a requirement for long-term focus, evaluation of goals, and the achievement of those goals. So at a portfolio level, I think good ESG portfolios, typically you're seeing turnovers of below 20%, because really it's about long-term benefits and avoiding long-term risks from an investment perspective. Now, the ESG certificate that we have built and are providing really relates to serving that need and that incredible gap between skills demand and skills availability. And I'm going to talk a little bit just about the Philippines, just to flag a couple of things. So first and foremost, this is a certificate that is built by practitioners for practitioners. And I think in that sense, it's really quite unique. All right, so it very, very much has a focus of practitioner needs in mind. There are over 17,000 candidates have registered for the certificate globally already, and 80% of the candidates who've taken the exam have passed. Now, I want to just touch on that because I think CFA Institute, there's quite a strong reputation for challenge in the CFA program, which is quite fitting and right. The ESG certificate, the pass rates are in the 80s. Okay, and I think that's important for people to understand. The probability of success is high. Now, I've had several conversations recently with global businesses who have operation centers in the Philippines, and they are desperate to hire in that market, and they are looking for skills and competencies in that market. So please bear in mind that although this is kind of a global challenge, it very much shows up in finance in the Philippines, both with local businesses, but also the global firms and the information processing that the Philippines supports the processing of. So here we go. Let's ask ourselves, who is taking the certificate currently? So if we break down those 17,000 people, this is what we find. So in that sort of inner circle, early adopters were all portfolio managers and analysts and fund managers. And then slowly we started to see as client-facing staff, so people in sales and relationship management, both on the institutional and private wealth side, started seeing strong interest and uptake in that area. Product development teams, of course, because all of the sustainability movement, if you like, is reliant on investment products which meet those targets. So of course, product development teams are critical. Wealth managers who advise the affluent on their allocations, investment strategists and consultants. And then interestingly, the sort of the wider group of uptake, if you like, increasingly we're seeing this in ratings and indices related businesses. Of course, businesses also need to communicate effectively. So you're seeing this in PR and corporate communication and marketing. Regulators who are really trying to drive this process and manage it effectively. And that means that there's legal risk and compliance. So of course, we're seeing uptake in that area. We are seeing significant uptake in the independent directors and trustees space, because these are the sort of ultimate overseers of business strategy and undertaking. And then, of course, also in the investment advisory space, which is kind of very closely linked to all of these. So it is a very broadly taken certificate. We are also seeing it being adopted increasingly by universities. So we have a couple of projects. The certificate was launched globally in September last year. And already we're seeing it being integrated as a standalone program into several university programs, both at the bachelor's and the master's level. And I think that's also important if we're going to kind of achieve a solution to the talent gap. Now, critically, people come on a call like this. What does the certificate cover? What does one learn in it? And I'm going to go through this because I think it's a really tough ask for Rob, who's going to talk about his experience afterwards, and just try and give some information that will help you kind of break down the task at hand. So very busy slide, apologies for that. There was quite a lot that I needed to get through on it. So the introduction, you can see ESG concepts and approaches, benefits and challenges, materiality, and the ESG megatrends, some of which I've touched on now. And then it moves into the ESG market and trying to understand what are the drivers of that market. Again, I've touched on some of those issues now. What exactly does ESG investing cover? What asset classes and how is it interpreted in each of those? Then the program moves on to the E pillar, if you like, the environmental pillar. And the numbers in brackets indicate the number of questions in the exam. Now, because there are 100 questions in the exam, and that'll give you fairly accurate percentage breakdowns without too much challenge. So you can see the kind of weighting. So those introductory chapters, 4 to 8%. And then we're starting to get into the kind of the key highlight areas, if you like, E, S, social factors, and G, which is typically quite well covered. Those typically weighting 6 to 12% in the program for each of those pillars. I'm going to call out the social factors. I think that there's been a strong history of governance focus in investment management. There's increasingly and very rapidly a focus on environmental factors. And I think you've seen that in the preceding slides. But the question of how these things impact people, okay, and the challenge of quantifying the impact on people, I think is a very, very interesting space and is a very important space for this. So critical that we have a look at those social factors as well. Then we move on, we go to engagement and stewardship. It is perhaps interesting to you that exclusion is the most commonly practiced form of sustainable investing. So we decide we're not going to invest in sector A or sector B. part of the reason why it's so popular is that it's so easy to do. So we've seen this sort of raft of exclusions that have very rapidly emerged around the war in Ukraine, for example, and those can very effectively and very quickly be identified and put into place. By AUM, the two biggest areas for strategies for sustainable investing are engagement and stewardship and ESG integration. So although exclusion is most commonly practiced and certainly the oldest, engagement and stewardship along with integration are by AUM the two most significant sort of approaches, if you like. And so we start with engagement and stewardship, and then we move on, and you can see the weighting now really starts to pick up. Something between 20 to 32% of the exam focuses on ESG analysis, valuation, and integration, which I think is what one would expect for this. And again, the critical part of integration. What is interesting is that ESG integration is turning out to be material in itself. So in other words, if you do ESG analysis alongside each step of traditional financial analysis, it improves investment outcomes. We go from valuation, integration, and analysis to integrated portfolio management, and we look at a range of different models, evaluating ESG investments, which of course is necessary to go into the portfolio analytics and client reporting side. So you can see that there is a really comprehensive coverage of ESG broadly, and investment management and ESG and how it is approached. So it looks at all those methodologies at all asset classes, but really does spend a lot of time focusing on engagement and ESG integration. So again, that's what it looks like. I think just to give you some idea, and I think Rob will talk about the demand. I mean, it is quite a chunky program. Just by way of comparison, the PRI certificates, which are 6 and 12 hours of learning. And incidentally, if you take this program, if you choose to pay the PRI, they will award you the PRI certificates without you having to take the PRI assessments. So that is really built into this program itself. But this program is roughly 100 to 130 hours of study. And the reason that range is quite large is a lot of it depends on your prior experience of investment management. As you can see, those big chapters towards the bottom definitely benefit from prior knowledge. The certificate, however, does not require prior knowledge. Okay, so that's another thing that I want to say, that I get asked a lot of questions. Do you need to be a CFA charter holder to take the certificate? The answer is no. The certificate is open to all, but I think there'd be great benefits to you in terms of surpassing its challenges if you had that experience in investment management, and that would cut down that study time from 130 hours to something considerably less. And in fact, Rob, if you have any sense of how long this took you, that would be an interesting comment from your side. Now, I put up just a couple of quotes from people, and I don't want to dwell on them for too long because we do have an opportunity to speak to Rob. But the first quote that I wanted to pull out: my training manual is now in constant use at my desk. So I think one of the really significant values of this program is it's taken an incredibly wide field and has drawn the kind of key issues and factors together and has presented it in a single source. So I think that has been a common message that I've heard from people, is that it's just an excellent reference source in itself. And then the bottom challenge, it's the bottom quote. It's quite a challenge not to get lost in ESG language and stay on top of all recent developments. And another point that I want to make about the certificate: ESG is a really rapidly moving field. If you just look back at the regulatory release that I showed, you can see that it's rapidly changing. And I mentioned that is not only a function of regulation and policy, but it's also a function of scientific understanding and the availability and improvement of data. Okay, so it's a rapidly changing field. And our decision in constructing the certificate was to provide this broad and very effective foundation that will allow people to locate these new developments, understand them rapidly, and position them within their understanding of the field as a whole. So that's why we refer to it as a foundational certificate. The idea is to put in this very solid foundation of general understanding so that as this field moves on, both at a national and international level, people are able to understand and locate that learning as they go. Now, let's talk a little bit about the certificate itself. I've mentioned by practitioners, for practitioners. It is a self-paced study program. So what does that mean? Once you've registered, you have a year in which to schedule and take your exam. All right. So how you want to tackle the content of the program is really up to you. But that is the mandated side. You've got to find 130 hours within that year. I think that it's really compelling reading. So I don't think that that's going to be an enormous challenge. But I do know, because we work a lot with corporates in my role, we do know a lot of people are very enthusiastic to register, and then they lose a little bit of momentum and they need a bit of a push and support to kind of really tuck into it. As I mentioned, there are no formal entry requirements. Now the exam, 100 questions, as I said, 2-hour, 20-minute exam. The price of the certificate is $675 US. Now, as a South African, I'm aware of the challenge that that price poses for people in emerging markets like South Africa and the Philippines. So it's a significant cost. I didn't want to gloss over it. I wanted to talk about it directly. I think if you do some research, you will find that this is an enormously competitively priced certificate. In fact, it is roughly half the cost of its next closest competitor, which doesn't necessarily make it a less bitter pill to swallow, but it is certainly very accessible relative to other offerings on the market. The examination is conducted through Prometrics exam centers. Let's start with that. And the Prometrics Center in the Philippines is at the Ateneo de Manila University, and that is the Salcedo campus, okay? So there is a physical test center for people to use. Please make sure that you book, because the bookings are subject to availability. The examination is different to the CFA program exams, which are sort of blocked exams. This is available 5 days a week, right around the year. So it is an open testing, you schedule and take the exam. Now, the other option is to do it through online proctoring. Okay, this means that you can take the exam in your own environment. I just want to kind of flag for people that there are system requirements that you have to meet in order to do that. And you will need to spend some time setting up the room. So remote proctoring actually has a proctor, a person on the other side of the screen, and they're going to instruct you on setting up your room. And I would, just based on my experience in talking to people, my advice would be, set aside 20 minutes or so in order to do that. So that will enable you to take the exam in your own home. I do know that people have had a lot of challenge with workplace firewalls. So if it's quite challenging for me to take the exam at home, I'm in a small place with a family, and I'm sure there are many people on this call who are in similar situations. Just be wary of the firewall challenge in the workplace, and it might be a better option to take it at a test center if the workplace is your only other option. I've mentioned the numbers. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take these when we get to the Q&A session. I think that kind of touches it on a high level. Now, if there are people here from the corporate side who are considering it as an adoption for their own organizations, here is a list of organizations. It's not an exhaustive list, just some examples. I've picked people from around the world, or firms from around the world. These are firms who have given us permission to use their name when talking about the certificate. I think because there is such a significant competition for talent in the ESG space, firms are in fact very, very keen to highlight, as they compete for talent, their status as sort of preferred employers in terms of supporting ESG learning. So not only is it critical and central to these businesses, but these businesses also see that as a way of attracting talent into their fold. If there are corporate people on the call, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just very briefly, there is an institutional adoption plan. Please reach out to myself, or I have an email address for Alicia Chan, my colleague, on the slide, but equally reach out to your colleagues at the CFA Society in the Philippines, and we will provide the support that is needed through that. So you can have any one of those contact points. Just one point here that I think is worth making: the institutional adoption plan requires prepayment for program vouchers, but doesn't include a discount. So we've really focused on keeping the margins very tight on this program. We think it's incredibly important, and we want it to be as accessible as possible for something of its size. Thank you so much for giving me the time to be here today. As I said, there's Alicia Chan's email address. If you'd like to reach out to Alicia to book a conversation with us in any form, we'd be more than happy to have that, or to go directly to your colleagues at CFA Society in the Philippines. Thank you so much. I hope it wasn't too fast and ripping through. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over to Rob Ramos. And I think I'm so grateful to Rob for being here today. Rob, thank you. There is nothing like hearing from a person who is in one's own market, who understands those market conditions, and who can offer some insights into the experience with the program. So thank you so much. I'll remain here for the Q&A.
Thank you, Richard. That was insightful, short, but really you gave everything that we need now as participants. So before we proceed on the Q&A session, we would like to call on the president of the CFA Society Philippines, Dr. Robert Ramos, CFA, Kaya, CIPM, to share his experience in preparing and passing the certificate in ESG investing.
Hi, Jerome. Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting this particular event. Richard, thank you. That was very insightful. Ladies and gentlemen, I am certificate number 1 in the Philippines, as Richard told me last year. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but yes, I am certificate number 1. As far as I know, there are 3 of us now in the Philippines, at the least. It was a very interesting experience. Let me share a very short presentation as to how I studied for the ESG certification and what were my challenges and what was my experience during the exam day. Similar to maybe any exam, or the CFA exam in particular, I think that's how the curriculum looks like. I only got the soft copy. I think the most important thing to do, this book is 574 rather, pages from cover to cover. And I've been managing portfolios, managing both retail and institutional relationships, and selling funds. So I've been through the whole gamut. I've been doing that for more than 25 years. But the certificate in ESG investing is something relatively new. It's not that popular in the Philippines, but there's been a very strong push to be very familiar with ESG because there's a lot of client interest. And I personally have a soft spot for ESG because I want to make this world a better place for my daughter and my grandchildren later on. In studying for the certificate in the ESG curriculum, understand that some of the concepts for even a fund managers do seem familiar, but some are pretty brand new. They talk about, PRI. You talk about certain concepts that you've never heard before. Like, what does a fund manager know about carbon emissions? And I had to relearn all of that. So my first comment to everybody is, number 1, read the chapters. If you don't understand, make sure that you do the end of the chapter questions. After each chapter, as Richard indicated, there are maybe at least 10 to 15 end of chapter questions. So please do them. That at least will allow you to assess your knowledge if you did understand the chapter or not. If you don't understand the chapter, that's fine. At least take note of the right answers and then move forward. After I was done with the book, I understood that I did not understand. I understood that I did not understand much. So I read the book again. I think all in all, I would say I pretty much read the book, if I'm not mistaken, around 7 times, from cover to cover, from end chapters to end chapter. There were some chapters that I felt that I needed more time. I think that was chapter 7 and chapter 8, because these were, the heavy question topics, particularly on valuation. So, and they of course interested me as well. So I read these chapters again. And that turned out to be the right call. The second is the practice exams. Aside from the end of the chapter questions, don't forget, after you read the book, you know what I did? Every time I would read the book, I would do the end of chapter exams again and again and again to drill myself. I would do this after work. So usually I did this during the pandemic. So effectively I would knock off work around 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the evening. So I would study around 8 to 9, sometimes 8 to 10 or roughly, or 8 to 9:30. I would study about an hour a day, or at least an hour a day rather. So I would make sure that I do the end of the chapter questions. And at the end of probably my third or fourth reading, I did a practice exam. With the curriculum, at least during my time last year, comes one practice exam. You can ask Richard later if that's still the case. So I suggest you take it, because in that particular practice exam, you're able to assess if you learned the whole concepts in the book. So, I think the first time I took it, I got 70. I remember that very distinctly, 70 or 71. So I think that's a passing score already, but I wanted to do better. So after that, I read the book twice more. And I did the practice exam another time. So after that, after the second practice exam, I got 84. I remember that again. So after doing that, I read the book twice more. And at the end of that second reading, after that second test, I scored in the 90s. Even if that practice exam is only one, you understand as you keep on taking it, you are refreshed. You see the questions in a different light because you have more knowledge. Review your mistakes, because eventually you will get the right answer when it's asked again, and then keep on taking it, keep on taking it, and keep on taking it. One thing that's also important in the practice exam, some people, the last time I took a very long test was, I had a UITF certification. That was a few years back. That was roughly a 3-hour exam. And before that was probably, some other exam, maybe for my doctorate or my CFA exams. So to take this particular exam, assuming that it's 2 hours and 20 minutes, you need endurance. So these practice exams allow you to build up that endurance. I'm sure some of you are lawyers, some of you are accountants, or even CFA charter holders. So I think that will give you some insight as to the endurance that you need for this particular exam. Because if you get tired, obviously your probability of passing goes down if you get tired while taking the exam. And when you take the practice exam, please make sure that you're very strict with the timeline. I have some friends who said they take it, they didn't do too well because effectively they were not strict. They would finish a practice exam, they do very well, but they would tell me, I took it in 4 hours, I took it in 5, or I'll stop and I'll do it again. I wasn't very, very strict as to the time I allocated myself. So if you take it, please make sure that you stick. You have 2 hours and 20 minutes, nothing more. And as Richard mentioned, I think this is the most interesting part, exam day. I took the exam last year, so that was at the midst of the lockdowns in the Philippines. Unlike now, I can work from the office. I could probably go to the exam center now if I wanted to. There is some flexibility if you want to take it from the benefit of your own home. First thing that you have to do is, of course, you have to reserve your slot early. My experience is, if you want to reserve a slot, you can't do it for the next day. You probably have to do it a week, or even better, 2 weeks in advance. And my particular experience is I couldn't do it at an hour I wanted. Let's say I wanted to do it at Saturday or Sunday at maybe 10 in the morning or 11 in the morning. The hours available for me were either 3 a.m. on Saturday and Sunday morning, 5 a.m., 6 a.m., and that was it. So I bit the bullet. I had no choice. So I signed up for a 5 a.m. exam one Saturday. So once that's set up, you are required to have your own room on exam day if you're taking it via remote proctoring. So via your own room, no one is allowed to come in or out of the room, or else they will stop the exam. So you either have to coordinate with your family members, or you have to find a little nook and cranny where no one will enter, at least for the next 2 hours and 20 minutes. Maybe give 30 minutes or more to set up. So this area should not be, cannot be entered by anybody for the next 3 hours. The next thing, and this is where the fun starts, download the exam application. I did it for 2 computers. I did it for my office computer, and luckily I also did it for a personal computer that I had at home. But ensure that your personal computer or your office computer is modified to allow the launch of the exam. On exam day, and this was something interesting for me, I could not, everything was set up, but I could not launch the exam from my office computer. The nice thing is the proctoring service that the CFA Institute uses was available. So I called them, it was long distance. I called their US number. And what happened was I could not access because my office did not allow allow the program to breach the firewall. So luckily I loaded it in my personal computer. But again, there was a problem, so I had to call long distance again. I had to set up the account name of my computer. So if you do not have an account name for your computer, let's say if you open a computer and it just says sign on, you have to indicate in your computer that this is your computer. So when you type in your name, you see Robert Ramos or whatever your name may be. So make sure that your computer is modified to allow you to sign on and you can see your name, so that it has to be named appropriately. So the second hurdle is, since there's a remote proctor, once you can log on, the proctor will then assist you. Make sure that there are no boxes or books or anything in front of you or behind you, because they will remove it. What happened to me was I had some boxes in front of me. I think these were, I forget what these were, but these were boxes of some things. So effectively, the proctor was going to say, okay, come back, log in later when you've cleared the boxes. Because if you take yourself out of the computer site of the proctor, they have to terminate the program. Remember, you cannot step away from the camera. So what I did, as I pulled the boxes away, I told the proctor, okay, if I stay in your site, can you stay with me? Because I have to wait for 10, 15 minutes for the proctor to stay on. I didn't want to wait anymore. So I just held the computer and moved the boxes out of the way. That took roughly 2 minutes, so I could proceed. The proctor check, meaning they look to your sides, to your front, under your chair. That proctor check takes about 10 minutes. You're allowed, I think, a 10-minute bathroom break in between. But if you stop taking your exam, what will happen is the proctor will have to check your surroundings again. And I didn't want to waste the time, so I just powered through. So I didn't take my bathroom break. And of course, last but not the least, during the exam, especially as you go towards the end, sometimes you feel like you just want to end the exam. Breathe, power through, review your answers, because sometimes in the midst of all things, taking a computer-based exam, you might be clicking on wrong answers. So please take your time to review. The nice thing with this particular exam is you can flag certain questions that you want to go back to. So the exam has that particular capability. You can actually track which questions you haven't answered and you can go back to them. So that's my personal experience on the exam day. Right after the exam, similar to my experience in my past studies, I was expecting that I would get an email maybe 2 weeks or 3 months after the exam. But this was very, very pleasant because right after the exam, literally as I submitted the exam, the result flashed and it said, congratulations, you passed the exam. So that was a very good day for me. And about 10 minutes later, the email from the CFA Institute will come and say, congratulations, you passed the ESG, the certificate in ESG exam. How does this benefit me? Personally, I believe that the exam has materials that were not in the CFA curriculum I took. That was several years back. This particular exam has a lot of material that I think is important to our current investor base. I believe it's very, very important that we are attuned to the needs of the times. Not only is right now, there's a push from the European markets at the start. Now there's a lot of push from the US markets. It would be folly for us to believe that it will not come to the Asian Pacific Center areas. The demand for this knowledge will be here soon, if not here already. So I personally believe that I took the challenge. I think that this is one way that I can actually upgrade my skills. And this is also one way that I can share my skills to the people I work with in the institutions I work for. And rightfully so, because right now we're looking at providing certain services that touch on this. So this was a great thing to have. Also from an institutional standpoint, we are actually supporting this particular mandate. My principals have actually encouraged the people I work with to take this exam as well, and we're actually supporting some exam takers who intend to take this exam either this year or next year. So that's it for me, Jerome. Happy to take questions later if there are any further clarifications. Thank you.
Yeah, Rob, I mean, good that you're able to read through the material 7 times. When it was my turn, I finished reading 2 days before my exam. So imagine the nervousness I felt. But I agree. I agree on all the comments that you shared. One thing that really helped me was really the back exam. Just to share, just to share also, I don't know if this will be useful to everyone. What I did when I was reading the materials, before reading the chapter, I would take the self-assessment questions. So 15 questions per chapter. It doesn't matter the score. I usually score about 3 or 4 correct answers, but it gave me a baseline. If I score very low, I would take more time to read the material. But I also echo Richard's comment earlier. He said that sometimes when you take the exam, you are on fire, then you lose momentum. It happens because the material is really heavy. I mean, it's chunky, to borrow the words of Richard. So you just have to power through it. For me, I just reminded myself that I paid almost $700 of my own money. So I had to finish this. I had to finish this, whatever happens. And even the offsite or the online exam, it's really, I mean, it's new because we're used to taking the exam on site, but you have to give yourself 20 or 30 minutes time to prepare because the proctor will really check everything. So I use my daughter's playroom. They really have to check everything, each corner, even the ceiling, they have to check it. So you have to give time for that. I shared my personal experience because I'm waiting for questions to come in. So that's the purpose. So I guess I'll take the first question to Richard while waiting for the others. So when I enrolled myself to the certificate in ESG investing, at that time my role was developing insurance products. So it's very connected, right? But when I finished last month, I had a new role now, handling independent wealth consultants. As the material said, one of the barriers is really the financial advisors. They're not yet pushing ESG themed products to investors. I guess in the context of the Philippines, there are very few funds that are really ESG themed. I saw and I think there's only one that is really SDG fund. I mean, top to bottom. It's not just using FIR or fund of funds. I guess my question is, given the lay of the land in the Philippines, ESG is still very new. Financial advisors and relationship managers are not aware. I mean, very few financial advisors or relationship managers are aware. I guess using the experience in other countries like Singapore, US, or UK as the benchmark, how can we, being in the industry, influence the adoption of ESG from maybe talking to retail clients, institutional clients, and even companies that we engage to us?
Jerome, thanks for the question. I'm going to give it my best shot. So the first thing that I would say is that there is really ever increasing evidence that 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 investments made with an ESG mindset outperform those that don't. Okay, so I think initially, you know, when and this is probably particularly when ESG or sustainability was originally sort of focused on exclusions, and it was really the province of, you know, like what seemed to be quite esoteric European thinking, if you like. I think there was a lot of conversation about, if I invest in something that's good, do I have to give up performance for it? Okay. Now, there is a part of ESG investing that is about that, which is impact investing. So impact investors are trying to achieve a social outcome, and they will, you know, measure the performance of their investment, both financially and in terms of that outcome. And some impact investors are willing to sort of give up some returns in order to achieve those outcomes. But I mean, it's a tiny fraction of the ESG market, impact investing, and I have great respect and you know, regard for people who think that way. But just as a general response, okay, that ultimately from an investor's perspective, ESG investing is about maximizing long-term returns and minimizing long-term risks. So from an investment perspective, it is a, you know, I think it is a very sound thesis, you know. So for example, there's an Oxford University study, I can't quote its exact title, but I remember it quite vividly. And it was kind of a study of studies. So it looked at 200 different, you know, studies of the performance of sustainable investments, okay, and focused right down on the institutions that those funds invested in, okay, you know, through a sustainability lens, if you like. And they found that good sustainability practices at a corporate level, the corporates who had good sustainability practices outperformed their peers in the market 80% of the time. You know, so I think these are kind of like, there's a return argument. So that would be the first point that I'd make. I think there's a return argument. The second is a risk argument. Okay, so one of the things that I think has really surprised me is the beauty about ESG is everyone's kind of new to it. So this is a question about whether, you know, if you're slightly less new if you're European, but everyone, it's, you know, is newish for people, should I put it that way. So I think that there's that opportunity to look at the world through a new lens, if you like, okay? And I think that if one is trying to advocate for sustainability in the market, then there are two sides. There's the risk, and then the newness, there's the return, and the newness part of it is the risk. So I mean, I can think of some examples of sustainability related risks that, you know, so for example, liability risk, there's transition risk, there are all kinds of risks which are covered in the certificate. And those are very material for investors. So for example, if investors are, you know, investing in long-term projects like power facilities, etc., and they find that those power facilities are on the receiving end of new legislation that dramatically alters their financial performance, those are kind of risks that people need to be aware of. So for me, advocating for sustainability is ultimately, it just makes dollars and cents, you know, if I can put it that way. I think the second part that I would focus on is, you know, the incredible importance of this. You know, like I think that one of the things that I find difficult with ESG is, as I've learned more and more, I've understood the impacts of climate change better and better, and they are massively significant, and I think particularly significant for countries like the Philippines. I don't know if any of you have seen the news from South Africa recently. We've just had massive flooding in South Africa, and that is a direct result of climate change. So, you know, I think those are short-term returns, like financial returns, long-term impact on societies and the way we live, I think is the argument that I would make.
Yes, thank you for your answer on that question. So you have two more questions from the audience.
Thank you. I see them.
Yeah, one I think is more, you know, once you register. The other one is more on when is the appropriate. So I'll ask first the first one, of course.
Sure.
Good day to all. I'm still at the university, and this is my first time to hear or heard of such opportunity. Richard, would it be more advisable to take such certificate exam when I had a working experience already?
Yeah, okay, so look, I'm going to go out on a limb here, all right, and you know, like I know and love the Philippines, but I don't live in the Philippines. So this is an answer that's sort of pre-pandemic, if you like. Okay. Based on my conversations with corporates, this is a difficult thing for me to say because I realize there's $675 at the back of this sentence. Okay. I really think if you take the certificate, you're going to get work opportunities that don't exist if you haven't taken it. I mean, I'm just going to be blunt and put it out there. And that is based on, the most recent conversation I've had with a corporate, and these are, again, global corporates with centers in the Philippines. Okay. And these aren't kind of traditional ops centers. These are data centers, and they are report writing centers that are focused on ESG. This particular corporate is looking to hire 1,000 people a year in Manila. So I'll just, and they are, they've come to us and said, look, if you recruit people for us, that would be great, and we'll pay for them to take the certificate. Okay, so it's a bit of a chicken and egg. So maybe if you get into a business where this is being offered, then one doesn't have this burden of cost. But I think that there is a short journey between the certificate and employment for people generally.
Yeah, and since the material is very dynamic, like you said, it's early. Having that foundation as early as possible, for me, it's really helpful. I took the exam last month, but I'm still reading or still listening to content about ESG. But that foundation really helps me. I'm not yet applying it at work for the moment, but having that in my pocket really helps. I hope that also give color to the question. Another question is, thank you for this session. How frequent are the exams, and how long is the gap between registration and the exam?
Right, thank you for the question. The gap between registration and taking the exam is 30 days. Okay, so you register for the program, you can't schedule an exam in those first 30 days. And then how frequent are the exams? The exams are 5 days a week. Depending on the exam center, between 1 and 3 sittings a day. And then, of course, online proctoring as well. So this is continuous examining, if you like. As Rob pointed out, if you want to write on a Saturday, and of course there are good reasons to do that because one isn't required to take leave, then the times that you're going to be offered by online proctors are going to be quite challenging. So they kind of probably using US proctors at the back end of their Friday, which is giving you the sort of Saturday morning slot. But as Rob pointed out, it's going to be an early slot. So yeah, and let me extend a couple of other questions here. If you don't pass the exam, it will cost you $475 to re-register. Okay, so there is a slightly discounted re-registration. Okay, I'm very much in your camp, Jerome, and Rob's camp. You think about the cost of this. It's worth kind of putting your nose to the wheel and going for it. You can take the exam a maximum of 3 times in 6 months. Okay, now that's a very unusual statistic. I can't imagine people doing that. But a lot of businesses are mandating this program in other parts of the world. So you're seeing that in Europe, you're seeing that in parts of Asia, you're seeing it in parts of Australia, for example. And people literally need the exam in order to continue some career process that they're on. So they kind of, want to write again and again and again and are willing to cover the cost. So those are the details around the exam. 2 other things that I think are worth saying. If you wanted to change the date of your exam, so Jerome, if you had bottled and decided, I'm not going to get through that final reading, I have to change the exam date, then that's going to cost $30. Okay, so that's what Prometric charges for a rescheduling. So it's also super expensive. And you cannot reschedule within 72 hours before your exam. So this is a reschedule that doesn't save you from, a bad trip to work or something like that, or failing to get to the exam center. So certainly the way I think, just eliminate all those probabilities. If you're going to the exam center, get there super early, like take your, I know what the traffic in Manila is like. Okay, so plan for the very worst, okay, that you've ever seen, and spend the time waiting rather than risk losing. And please also make sure that you check the ID requirements. Okay, so the identity documents that you're required to take to that exam. Nothing breaks my heart more as a CFA Institute employee when I get a call from people who say, look, I'm at the exam center and I've forgotten this and they won't let me in. And I so badly want to help someone in that situation and I just can't. So make sure you read all those things, you stick to the times, then there's not a problem. The opportunity set on the other side of this, to touch on Jerome's point, this is new for many of us, okay? But I'm astonished at the rate of change, okay? It's just staggering, you know. So, for example, PwC announced not too long ago that they're hiring 100,000 people into their sustainability center. Similarly at Deloitte, okay, so it's not just pure asset management, investment management businesses, it's the periphery as well. Banks are big consumers of the certificate, all the people that I mentioned.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think also just to have a few comments on the question. When you register, you're given, I think, a year to take the exam.
Correct.
You don't have, when you register, you don't have to register for your exam, like Rob
Correct.
said, 2 weeks.
Correct.
You can take time. You can read the material first, assess yourself when you're ready, and then register maybe 2 to 3 weeks ahead, right? So
yeah,
for something that's useful too.
I think that's good advice, Jerome. Absolutely. You know, like at least get a taste of what you're up against and how you're progressing, and then make a judgment about the exam. If you're like me, a deadline helps with motivation. So, you know, balance that would be my recommendation. The other comment that I'll make is that because these concepts are new, even the language is quite new, you know, certainly, you know, was for me. So if you can find people who are studying at the same time, I think there's a great advantage in conversations about this stuff, you know. And then the research reports that are being issued by the majority of research houses around sustainability, and then some of those key names that I mentioned there, OECD, World Bank, you know, the Global Carbon Project, all of these, you know, there's a lot of material out there that you start to kind of get a familiarity with these terms and concepts. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, actually what I did, like I said, there are a lot of materials out there. So I did when I registered myself for the exam. I didn't study at first. I watch a lot of content in YouTube. I read a lot of articles just to get that background about ESG.
Yeah.
And then I limit myself to 12 weeks to study the material. If you have more time, like if you're at school, if you're still working from home and you have a lot of spare time, it also helps to have a longer study period.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you, Dr. Robert Ramos, for the time, and of course to Richard for taking the time to talk to us here. To our participants, please turn your attention to the screen for the QR code of your online evaluation. Please take time to answer the survey. It will just take about a minute to complete. But of course not the least, let's turn on our videos for the photo opportunity with our guest speaker for today. So I guess Precious will take the lead on this. Can you please turn on your videos? Of course, to those that are comfortable. Walang pilitan. So if your camera ready, take this opportunity. Okay, who's gonna take the photo? Precious, are you going to take the photo?
Yes, Jerome.
Yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. One more for the other side. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Nice.
everyone. And just a huge thanks to CFA Society Philippines, to Rob, to Jerome, to John, to Precious, who's in the background here. So thank you so much to all of you and for people who joined today. Really appreciate your time. Please feel free if anyone would like to speak to me. I'm happy to share my email address or reach out to CFA Society Philippines and they can connect you to me. I'd love to speak. So thank you so much to everyone.
Yeah, you can find Richard in LinkedIn. I just searched him a while ago. So again, thank you for attending this session. We would like to thank again our sponsor, our platinum sponsor, COA Philippines Inc., silver sponsor, Video Capital, Coco Life Asset Management Company Inc., and FTI Consulting Philippines Inc., bronze sponsor, AP Securities Incorporated, DBP, Daiwa Capital Markets Philippines, and of course, Papa Security Corporation. This concludes our webinar. So again, thank you for attending in behalf of the local society. Thank you for taking the time. Richard, thank you also for talking to us. See you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe, stay well. Bye-bye.